"Ma'am, coach is in the back," the white woman said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, and the air inside Flight 287 seemed to tighten all at once. Naomi Brooks paused with one hand resting on the worn leather strap of her carry-on, her boarding pass still between her fingers, the thin paper trembling only because the cabin vents blew cold from overhead. The aisle was narrow, crowded with rolling bags, winter coats, and the impatient rustle of people trying to settle into their seats. But somehow the woman's voice cut through all of it like a clean blade. Naomi looked up slowly. She was 58, dressed in a charcoal cardigan, dark slacks, and low sensible flats that had carried her through more airports than most people saw in a lifetime. Her hair, neatly silver at the temples, was pulled back in a soft knot. She did not look lost. She did not look confused. She looked exactly like a woman who knew where she was going. But Claire Whitmore, wrapped in a cream cashmere travel set and the kind of polished confidence money often mistook for class, gave her a smile so thin it barely deserved the name. Beside her, a little girl of maybe 8 sat stiff in the window seat, clutching a pale pink neck pillow to her chest. Across the aisle, a man in loafers and a navy quarter-zip glanced up from his phone, then just as quickly looked away. No one wanted trouble before takeoff. That was the strange thing about public humiliation in America. Most people recognized it the second it entered the room. Few ever reached for it. Naomi lowered her eyes to her ticket, not because she doubted herself, but because composure had become a habit so deep it lived in her bones. Row 19. Seat C. Exactly where she was standing. "I'm in the right place," she said, her voice low and even. It should have ended there. A decent person would have let it end there. But Claire gave a little laugh, the kind wrapped in perfume and practiced innocence. "Really?" she said. "Because first glance can be misleading." A few heads turned. Someone near the overhead bins stopped lifting a suitcase. A flight attendant at the front of the cabin was greeting boarding passengers with a bright, professional smile, unaware that 20 feet back, decency was being tested. Over seat assignments and skin. Naomi felt the familiar heat rise in the back of her neck. Not new, not dramatic, just old. The old ache of being looked at and reduced in the same second. She had known that feeling in department stores, in bank lines, in hotel lobbies where people handed her keys they assumed she was there to park. Years ago, she had learned that sometimes dignity was not in what you said back. Sometimes it was in refusing to perform your pain for strangers. So she slid gently into seat 19C, placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, and folded her coat across her lap with careful hands. Claire stared for half a beat too long, as if waiting for embarrassment to bloom on Naomi's face. It didn't. The little girl by the window shifted and whispered, "Mom, I don't feel good." Claire turned instantly, all polished irritation softening into distracted maternal concern. Naomi looked out toward the oval window across the aisle, where a baggage cart rolled beneath the fading gold of a North Carolina evening. The tarmac lights had begun to glow. The plane smelled faintly of coffee, recirculated air, and the clean synthetic scent of new upholstery. Then the overhead speaker clicked alive, and the captain's voice came through warm, calm, unmistakably Southern. "Good evening, folks. This is Captain Daniel Hayes welcoming you aboard." Naomi's breath caught before she could stop it. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coat. For a second, the cabin, the whispering, the insult, all of it seemed to fall away beneath the sound of that name. The name settled over Naomi like warm light through old glass, sudden and impossible, and for a moment she was no longer in seat 19C with her knees tucked neatly beneath the tray table and a stranger's contempt still hanging in the air. She was back under the yellow fluorescence of Charlotte Douglas nearly 22 years earlier, when the floors near Gate 14 always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, and rain dragged in on travelers' shoes. She could still see a skinny white boy in a wrinkled shirt sitting alone near the vending machines after midnight, his flight manual spread across his lap, his face too tired for someone that young. Daniel Hayes. He had not looked like much then. None of them ever did in the beginning. Just another kid with a dream bigger than his wallet and a silence in him that made Naomi notice. Back then she had worked the late shift at the airport cafe, pouring refills, wiping counters, slipping extra napkins into paper bags, learning how to tell the difference between ordinary hunger and the kind that comes from trying to hold your life together with almost nothing. Daniel had come in 3 nights in a row and ordered only hot water. On the 4th, Naomi had set down a bowl of chicken noodle soup and half a turkey sandwich in front of him and told him to argue with her after he finished eating. He never did. The plane hummed around her, low and mechanical, while passengers reached for seat belts and adjusted air vents overhead. Naomi blinked once and pulled herself gently back into the present. Claire Whitmore had gone quiet, though not out of reflection. She was busy smoothing a monogrammed blanket across her daughter's lap, while checking the time on a gold watch that flashed under the cabin lights. The little girl, Emily, looked pale now, her small fingers twisted into the neck pillow with the fierce grip of someone trying not to unravel in public. Naomi saw the signs immediately. The shallow breathing, the fixed stare, the stiff shoulders. Fear lived differently in children. It had fewer disguises. Across the aisle, a man coughed into his sleeve. Somewhere toward the back, an overhead bin thumped shut. At the front of the cabin, a flight attendant with auburn hair and a calm smile began walking row by row, checking that bags were stowed and electronics were switched to airplane mode. Her name tag read Tessa Reed. When she reached row 19, she gave Naomi the same professional nod she had given everyone else, which in itself felt like a kind of grace. Naomi waited until Claire looked away, then said softly, "Excuse me, miss." Tessa bent slightly, attentive without being intrusive. Naomi reached into her purse and touched the corner of the old paper envelope she always carried when she flew, as if the feel of it might steady her. "Could you please send a message to the cockpit?" she asked, her voice almost lost beneath the murmur of settling passengers. "Tell Captain Hayes that Naomi Brooks from Gate 14 is on board." Tessa blinked. Once. Not rudely. Just surprised. "Of course," she said after a beat, though curiosity flashed across her face before training smoothed it away. Claire turned so fast the cashmere at her shoulder whispered against the seat. "I am sorry," she said, every syllable polished and pointed. "Did she just ask you to interrupt the captain?" Naomi did not look at her. Tessa stayed professional, but the slightest tension touched her mouth. "It is all right, ma'am," she said. "I can pass along a message." Claire let out a short, amused breath and leaned back as though the whole thing had confirmed something ugly she had already decided to believe. "Well," she murmured, loud enough again, "that is certainly one way to feel important." Naomi kept her gaze forward, though her heart had begun to beat a little harder now, not with shame, but with memory. She had not seen Daniel in years. Not since a young man with red eyes and trembling hands had stood beside her airport counter, holding a rejection letter from a flight program he could not afford to reapply for. Not since she had pressed 3 folded $20 bills into his palm from her own grocery money and told him that other people's ceilings did not have to become his sky. Tessa moved up the aisle toward the galley, one hand brushing the tops of the seats for balance as the cabin door prepared to close, and Naomi sat perfectly still, listening to the soft roar build beneath the floor, wondering whether some acts of kindness ever really left the people who received them. The cabin door sealed with a thick mechanical thud, and the sound seemed to travel through Naomi's ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside the oval windows, the last of the daylight lay flat across the runway in long copper bands, broken by service trucks and the slow blinking of blue taxiway lights. Inside, everything narrowed to the small rituals of departure. Seatbelts clicked. Window shades shifted. A baby somewhere near row 26 gave a tired whimper and then fell quiet again. Naomi rested one hand over her purse and kept her breathing steady, but her eyes stayed on the front galley where Tessa had disappeared behind the curtain. She had not expected anything from the message, not really. Life had taught her that most kindness moved forward without applause. And most people, once they climbed high enough, could not afford to look down too long at where they began. Still, the name Daniel Hayes had opened something old inside her, something tender and careful and almost too private for daylight. Beside the window, Emily Whitmore swallowed hard and pressed the pink pillow tighter against her chest. Her face had gone a little whiter under the cabin lights. Claire noticed it now, though only in glances between checking her reflection in the black screen of her phone and adjusting the gold bracelet at her wrist. "You are fine, sweetheart," she said. But she said it the way some people spoke to delayed room service, impatient with the existence of discomfort itself. "It is just a flight." Emily nodded, though it was clear she was not fine. Her breathing came shallow and quick. Naomi had heard that rhythm before too, in children waiting outside emergency rooms, in first-time flyers gripping church fans on summer trips home, in grown men at hospital bedsides pretending they were not afraid. Fear had a sound if you lived long enough to know it. The plane began to move, so softly at first it felt like a thought rather than motion. Then the floor under Naomi's shoes gave a low rolling vibration as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Claire looked briefly satisfied, as if departure itself confirmed the natural order of things. Naomi turned her face toward the aisle and closed her fingers around the edge of the paper envelope in her purse. Inside it was the old receipt from Gate 14, folded around a tiny silver pilot pin Daniel had mailed to her years after flight school, with one line written in blue ink beneath it. You fed the dream before the world saw it. She had almost not come on this trip. Her sister Loretta in Denver had insisted after 3 canceled visits and 1 winter surgery Naomi had downplayed over the phone. You are not getting younger, Nye, Loretta had said. And neither am I. So Naomi had booked the cheapest decent seat she could find, packed 1 navy dress, 1 cardigan, church shoes, and the envelope she never traveled without. A small proof that some seeds did take root. The curtain near the galley shifted. Tessa stepped back into view, but she was not alone. Another flight attendant leaned in close to whisper something to her, and both women glanced toward row 19 before quickly looking away again. Naomi felt the change before she understood it. It moved through the cabin like a pressure drop, subtle but real. The man across the aisle lowered his magazine. 2 college boys near row 16 stopped talking over each other. Even Claire straightened a little, irritation giving way to alert curiosity. At the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened a few inches, then wider, and a tall man in a crisp navy uniform with 4 silver stripes on each shoulder stepped into the aisle. He looked older now, broader in the chest, silver beginning at his temples, but the way he searched the cabin was the same as it had been years ago at midnight under fluorescent lights, intent and hungry and full of hope that had cost him something. Then Captain Daniel Hayes saw her, and he stopped walking as if the whole aircraft had suddenly become still. For 1 suspended second, no one moved. The soft engine hum beneath the cabin floor seemed to fade behind the quiet, and Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the aisle, with one hand still resting on the edge of the cockpit door, staring toward row 19, as if he had just seen a part of his own past step back into the light. His face changed first. Not dramatically, not in a way meant for an audience, but in the small human ways that could not be rehearsed. His shoulders eased. The tight professional set of his mouth loosened. Something almost boyish, almost disbelieving, passed through his eyes. Then he started walking. Not toward first class. Not toward the premium rows where Claire Whitmore had likely assumed important people belonged. He walked straight down the narrow coach aisle, polished black shoes quiet against the carpet, his gaze never leaving Naomi Brooks. The passengers nearest the aisle pulled their elbows in. Heads turned one by one. A man in row 17 lowered his headphones. The college boys farther up stopped pretending not to stare. Claire sat frozen for the first time since boarding, 1 manicured hand still resting on Emily's blanket, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and offense. Naomi did not stand. She did not wave. She only lifted her chin a fraction, her fingers still resting over the purse in her lap, as Daniel stopped beside her seat and looked down at her with a kind of reverence that made the whole row feel suddenly smaller. Miss Brooks, he said softly, and the title carried more respect than some people ever managed with a whole speech. Naomi gave him a small, careful smile. Hello, Daniel. Claire blinked at the use of his first name. Naomi had not called him Captain. She had called him Daniel, and somehow that unsettled the order Claire trusted more than turbulence. Daniel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh and almost like relief. I cannot believe this is really you, he said. Tessa said Naomi Brooks from Gate 14, and I thought there is no way. Not after all these years. Naomi's smile deepened, touched with something private and old. It has been a long time. Daniel glanced down at her purse, as if memory itself had a shape. Do you still have it? He asked. Naomi hesitated only a moment before opening the purse and drawing out the worn paper envelope. The edges were soft from years of travel. She unfolded it with the care people reserve for photographs and faith. Inside lay the tiny silver pilot pin, no larger than 2 quarters side by side. its wings dulled with age but still unmistakable. Daniel looked at it, and his throat worked once. "You kept it," he said, almost under his breath. Naomi nodded. "I keep things that mattered." The sentence landed gently, but it carried weight. Claire looked from the pin to Daniel, then back to Naomi, and her face began to drain of color beneath the cabin lights. Emily, still pale but now distracted from her fear, lifted her head and whispered, "Mom, why is the pilot talking to her like that?" Claire did not answer. She could not. Daniel crouched slightly, so he was nearer Naomi's eye level. A captain in full uniform, making himself smaller in the middle of coach, because gratitude had taught him something status never could. "You fed me for 2 months when I had $7 to last a week," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for 3 rows to hear. "You paid for my second application exam when I was too ashamed to ask anyone for help. You told me not to let other people's ceilings become my sky." Naomi looked down at the pin in her palm, and for the first time since boarding, the sting of Claire's earlier words seemed to fall away like dust from a coat. Around them, the cabin stayed perfectly still, not because a captain had stepped into coach, but because the woman they had overlooked was suddenly being seen in full. The words hung in the cabin with a weight no one could ignore. Even the usual pre-flight bustle seemed to hesitate around them, as if the airplane itself had paused to listen. Daniel remained slightly bent beside Naomi's seat, one hand resting on the armrest across the aisle for balance, his face open with a gratitude so unguarded it made the polished authority of his uniform feel almost secondary. Naomi closed her fingers gently over the silver pin and slipped it back into the envelope, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. Some treasures were never meant for display. "You were a good young man," she said quietly. "You just needed somebody to remind you not to quit too early." Daniel gave a small shake of his head, and the corners of his eyes tightened with emotion he was trying not to carry into the cockpit. "No, ma'am," he said. "I needed somebody to see me when I was invisible." That landed deeper than anything else. Across the row, Claire Whitmore sat perfectly still, her spine rigid against the leather seat, one hand now flat on her own lap, as though she no longer trusted it to move naturally. A flush had crept up her neck and settled beneath the soft powder on her cheeks. Naomi did not look at her, but she could feel the woman's discomfort the way people feel a storm before the clouds arrive. Emily, caught between fear and curiosity, looked from Daniel to Naomi with wide, uncertain eyes. "Did she know you when you were little?" she asked in a whisper that somehow traveled farther than Claire's earlier remarks had. Daniel smiled at the girl, and in that smile there was kindness, but also something firmer, a gentle correction being laid into the room without anyone needing to say the word shame out loud. "She knew me when I was trying to become who I am now," he said, "and she helped me get there." The man across the aisle cleared his throat and looked down at his shoes. 2 rows back, someone who had been watching openly now pretended great interest in the safety card tucked into the seat pocket. Claire finally found her voice, but it came out thin, stripped of the lacquer it had worn during boarding. "Well," she said, attempting a smile that did not quite form, "that is certainly unexpected." Daniel turned his head then, slowly, and for the first time his attention settled fully on her. He was not rude. He did not raise his voice. Yet something in his expression changed the temperature of the moment. "Some of the most important people in my life have been unexpected to others," he said. The sentence was simple, but it closed every door Claire might have tried to slip through. Naomi felt a faint ache behind her ribs, not from hurt now, but from the strange tenderness of seeing decency defend itself without noise. Daniel straightened to his full height and glanced toward the front galley, where Tessa waited with one hand lightly touching the curtain, clearly unsure whether she should interrupt. Duty returned to Daniel's face in clean lines. They still had a flight to operate, weather to watch, passengers to carry safely through the dark. But before he turned away, he looked back down at Naomi once more. "I have thought about Gate 14 more times than you know," he said. "Every hard day, every check ride, every time I wondered if I belonged in the left seat. I kept hearing your voice." Naomi smiled, softer now, and smoothed the folded coat on her lap. "Then I am glad you kept listening." Daniel nodded once, deeply, like a man receiving something sacred rather than casual. Then, with the whole cabin still watching, he said the one thing Claire could never take back from the woman beside her. "Miss Brooks, it is an honor to have you on my aircraft tonight." For a moment after Daniel said it, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. An honor, not a courtesy, not a polite little phrase handed out with smiles and coffee. An honor. Naomi felt the words settle somewhere deep, somewhere old and bruised and careful. She had spent enough years moving through the world to know how rarely respect arrived without conditions. Daniel gave her one last look, warm and steady, then stepped back into the aisle. I need to get us in the air, he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted with a trace of the young man he used to be. But I would really like to speak with you after we land, if you will allow me. Naomi nodded once. I would like that. He glanced toward Tessa, who straightened at once. Please make sure Miss Brooks is comfortable, he said. Again, there was nothing theatrical in his tone. He was not performing for the cabin. That was what made it land so hard. Then he turned and headed back toward the cockpit, the rows parting for him in silence. And only when the cockpit door closed behind him did the ordinary sounds of the aircraft begin to return. A cough, the rustle of a magazine, the faint squeak of a child shifting in a seat. But the air had changed. It was still the same narrow cabin, the same overhead bins, the same tired carpet and dim gold lighting. Yet something invisible had broken open. People were looking at Naomi differently now. Not because she had become someone else in the last 3 minutes, but because they had finally been shown what had always been there. Tessa leaned in with a softness that felt more personal now than procedural. Would you like me to move you to an open Comfort Plus seat, Miss Brooks? She asked quietly. Claire turned her head at that, quick and sharp, as if the suggestion itself offended her. Naomi noticed, but did not react. She looked down at her folded coat, smoothed the sleeve once, and shook her head. That is kind of you, she said. But this seat is just fine. Tessa hesitated, then smiled in a way that carried understanding. All right. If you need anything at all, please let me know. When she moved on, Claire sat very still beside the window, but stillness looked different on her now. Before, it had been made of superiority. Now it looked like strain. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist again, then reached for her phone, then set it back down without unlocking it. The gestures were small, restless, and useless. Emily glanced up at her mother, then back at Naomi. Were you really there when he was young? The girl asked. Claire opened her mouth, likely to stop the conversation, but Naomi answered first, her voice gentle. Enough that the child did not flinch from it. Yes, she said. A long time ago. Emily studied her with the solemn concentration children sometimes wore when they sensed a truth the adults around them were still failing to understand. Did you know he would be a pilot? Naomi looked toward the cockpit door, its metal surface closed and quiet under the warm cabin lights. In her mind, she could still see that skinny boy at gate 14, shoulders bent over dog-eared manuals, pretending hunger was a scheduling issue and not a money one. She remembered the smell of coffee gone bitter on the burner, the scrape of mop buckets over tile after midnight, the way Daniel used to blink hard when he was trying not to show disappointment. I knew he loved flying before he ever touched the sky, she said. Emily seemed to hold that answer in both hands. Claire gave a faint, uncomfortable laugh, but it died quickly in the space between them. Outside the window, the aircraft turned toward the runway. The engines deepened with a low gathering power that seemed to vibrate through the seat frames and tray tables. Naomi reached for her seat belt and checked the buckle once more, calm by habit. Beside the window, Emily pressed the pink pillow tighter against her chest. Her breathing had gone thin again. Naomi heard it at once, the little catches between breaths, the tiny pauses that meant fear was returning stronger than before. And when the plane began its final roll toward takeoff, the child's small hand started to tremble against the blanket in her lap. The engines gathered themselves beneath the floor like something enormous drawing in breath, and the whole aircraft began its smooth, deliberate turn toward the runway. Naomi felt the change through the soles of her shoes, and the metal frame of her seat before the passengers around her seemed to register it. The lights in the cabin dimmed a touch. Outside the window, the line of runway lamps stretched into the distance like a string of stars pinned low to the earth. Beside Claire, Emily's fingers tightened so hard around the pink pillow that her knuckles went pale. Her breathing, already thin, started to break apart completely now. Quick little pulls of air that never seemed to reach where they needed to go. Claire leaned in, her voice dropping into that strained brightness adults used when they were afraid themselves and hoped volume might cover it. Emily, honey, look at me. You are fine. It is just takeoff. We do this all the time. But Emily was no longer really hearing her. Her eyes had fixed on the small oval window, then shut tight. Her shoulders rose toward her ears. The child was trying to be brave, and failing in that silent, miserable way that made everything harder to watch. Naomi turned her head slowly. She did not want to intrude. She knew too well how some mothers guarded control more fiercely than kindness. But fear had a rhythm, and Emily's had begun to race into dangerous ground. Naomi had heard it years ago in her own son Isaiah before hospital scans, heard it in airport terminals after storm delays, heard it once in Daniel Hayes when he was 19 and convinced one bad exam score had ended his whole future. Panic changed people's faces first, then their hands, then their breathing, until the body forgot it was safe. Claire placed a hand on Emily's arm. "Sweetheart, stop doing that. You are making yourself more upset." The words were meant to help, but they landed wrong. Emily shook her head fast, tears pushing up now, her chest moving in shallow, uneven pulse. "I cannot," she whispered. "Mom, I cannot." The row seemed to shrink around that small confession. Across the aisle, the man with the magazine looked away out of courtesy. Somewhere farther back, the safety demonstration ended and a flight attendant took her jump seat. The aircraft paused for one long second at the runway threshold. Naomi could feel the engines holding, waiting, gathering power. She looked at Claire then, not sharply, not with triumph, just with the plain, steady expression of someone offering a hand without announcing it. "May I try something?" she asked softly. Claire stared at her, as if the question itself required translation. Pride flickered across her face first, then uncertainty, then the unmistakable terror of a mother realizing she was losing ground. Emily made a small, desperate sound and covered her mouth with both hands. The decision broke open inside Claire all at once. She gave the smallest nod. Naomi turned toward the child, careful and unhurried, keeping her own body still so there was nothing sudden to fear. "Emily," she said, her voice low enough that it seemed to make a little shelter in the noise. "I want you to look at my hand, not the window. Just my hand." The girl's eyes fluttered open, wet and frightened. Naomi lifted one hand between them, palm warm under the cabin light, and curled her fingers slowly one by one. "We are going to count the breath, not chase it. One finger in, one finger out. That is all. You do not have to be brave. You only have to follow me." Outside, the engines surged, and the plane began to race down the runway. The force of takeoff pressed everyone gently back into their seats as the aircraft surged forward, the runway lights outside streaking into bright white lines against the darkening field. The engines rose into a deep, steady roar that filled the cabin and rattled faintly in the tray tables. But Naomi kept her hand lifted between herself and Emily, as if sound itself had no authority there. "That is it," she said, her voice calm and low, never fighting the noise, only moving under it. "One finger in, one finger out. We are not racing the plane. We are only counting." Emily's eyes were wide and wet, locked on Naomi's hand with the fierce concentration of a child hanging onto the one solid thing she could find. Naomi curled her thumb and slowly, "Breathe in." Then she opened it again. "Breathe out." The girl tried, stumbled, tried again. Her shoulders still trembled, but the rhythm began to catch in tiny pieces. Claire sat frozen beside her daughter, one hand half lifted and useless in the charged little space between them. She was a woman used to solving discomfort with upgrades, schedule changes, sharper voices, better hotels, faster service. But none of those things could reach a child whose body had forgotten how to feel safe. Naomi did not look at Claire. She kept her attention on Emily, on the rise and fall of that small chest, on the panicked little pauses that were beginning, slowly, to lengthen into steadier breaths. The nose of the aircraft lifted. The cabin tilted. Somewhere in the back, a bottle rolled softly against the floor before settling. Emily flinched at the change, and her fingers clamped hard around the blanket on her lap. Naomi lowered her hand just enough to show the next count. "You are doing fine," she said. "Not perfect. Fine. Fine is enough." That seemed to reach the child in a way reassurance had not. Emily nodded once, a quick, jerky motion, and copied Naomi again. "In for one finger. Out for one finger." Naomi shifted to two. "Now with me. In for two. Hold it soft. Out for two." The girl followed, still shaky, but present now, no longer drowning inside the feeling. Claire turned her face toward Naomi, and for the first time since boarding, there was nothing sharp in her expression. Only confusion, guilt, and the raw helplessness of a mother watching someone else succeed where she could not. Her lips parted, but no words came. The plane climbed through a bank of cloud, and the cabin gave a brief shiver, not violent, only enough to stir a few nervous glances and make Emily's eyes jump. Naomi did not pretend it had not happened. That bump was just air, she said. Same as a pothole on the road. The plane knows what to do. Captain Hayes knows what to do. At the mention of his name, something small and almost trusting returned to Emily's face. Children believed in competence long before they understood it. Naomi smiled gently. And right now, so do you. 3 in, 3 out. Emily obeyed. This time the breath reached deeper. Her shoulders eased by a fraction. Then another. The color began to come back to her cheeks in the warm cabin light. Claire looked down at her own hands, still immaculate, still ringed in gold, and seemed not to know what to do with them. Naomi kept counting until Emily's breathing matched the rhythm of the climb, until the child no longer gripped the pillow like a life preserver, but held it like an ordinary thing again. Only then did Naomi lower her hand to her lap. Emily swallowed and whispered, almost embarrassed by how small her voice sounded now. It is not as bad when you count it. Naomi nodded. Most hard things are not. And beside the window, Claire Whitmore closed her eyes for one brief second, as if the truth of that had found a place in her it had not been allowed to enter before. By the time the aircraft broke through the last layer of cloud, the climb had smoothed into something steadier, and the seat belt sign glowed softly. Above the aisle, like a patient little command no one wanted to challenge. The roar of takeoff eased into the deeper, calmer hum of cruising altitude, and with it the tension in row 19 began to loosen by degrees. Emily's breathing was no longer splintered. It came in small, careful pulls now, uneven but real, each one finding its way farther into her chest than the last. Her fingers had relaxed around the pink pillow. The tight shine of panic in her eyes had dulled into exhaustion. Naomi kept her hand resting on her lap and did not crowd the child with more words than she needed. Some people thought comfort meant filling every silence. Naomi had learned long ago that real comfort often meant making a safe place for silence to return. Claire sat beside her daughter as if she had forgotten how to arrange her own face. The polished confidence from boarding was gone now, peeled back by something too honest to hide beneath manners. She looked at Emily, then at Naomi, then down at the monogrammed blanket across her lap. Her throat moved once, twice. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low Naomi almost did not hear it over the engines. Thank you. It was not graceful. It was not elegant. But for the first time since they had met, it was real. Naomi turned her head and met Claire's eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no lesson delivered with a smile sharp enough to wound. She was scared, Naomi said simply. That is all. Claire let out a breath that seemed to cost her something. She glanced toward Emily, who had leaned her temple against the window and closed her eyes, still holding the pillow but no longer hiding behind it. She has hated flying since she was 5, Claire said after a moment. One bad storm coming back from Boston, and now every trip starts like this. I keep telling her it is safe, but when it starts, the sentence drifted off, unfinished and embarrassed by its own helplessness. Naomi looked toward the little girl, then back at Claire. Sometimes safety is not the first thing the body believes, she said. Sometimes it needs a rhythm before it can hear reason. Claire nodded slowly, as if the words were fitting into a place already cracked open inside. How did you know what to do? She asked. Naomi's fingers brushed the edge of the paper envelope in her purse. Then, after a brief pause, she answered with the same quiet honesty she had given Daniel. My son used to be afraid before hospital scans, she said. The machines were loud. The rooms were cold. Counting the breath gave him something smaller to hold on to. Claire's face changed again, softer this time, stripped of defense. Your son, she repeated carefully, and Naomi nodded once. Isaiah. The name sat between them like a candle flame, small but bright enough to change the room around it. Naomi did not explain further. She did not say how old he had been, or how long ago, or what it had done to her to lose a child, and still go on speaking gently to the world. She did not need to. Some grief spoke loudest through what people chose not to display. Claire lowered her eyes, and when she looked up again, there was something fragile in them that had not been there before. Shame, yes, but also the beginning of understanding. At that moment, Tessa appeared beside the row with the practiced quiet of a flight attendant who knew when to step lightly into private moments. She took one look at Emily's calmer face, then at Naomi, and her own expression warmed with instant comprehension. "Looks like we are doing a little better up here," she said softly. Emily opened her eyes just enough to nod. Tessa smiled. "Captain Hayes asked me to check on Miss Brooks when we leveled off," she said. "He also asked me to let him know if she needed anything at all." Claire looked at Naomi then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a seat assignment, not a code, not a category, but a woman other people trusted with their fear. Tessa knelt slightly beside Naomi's seat so she would not have to speak over the rows, her auburn ponytail catching the warm cabin light each time the plane gave a small, steady hum through the air. "Captain Hayes would like to know if you would accept an open seat in the forward cabin now that we are at cruising altitude," she said. "There is more legroom, and he said it would make him very happy." Naomi smiled, touched, but unsurprised by Daniel's impulse to give back in whatever form he could find. She glanced down at her shoes, then at Emily resting quietly against the window, the pink pillow now tucked beneath her cheek like an ordinary travel cushion instead of a shield. The child looked tired, but peaceful. Claire sat beside her with both hands folded too carefully in her lap, as if sudden movements might break whatever had settled over the row. Naomi looked back at Tessa and shook her head. "That is generous," she said, "but I am where I need to be." Tessa held her gaze for a moment, then nodded with the kind of understanding that did not require explanation. "I thought you might say that," she said softly. "In that case, can I at least bring you some tea?" Naomi let out the faintest laugh. "Hot tea would be lovely. Coming right up." When Tessa moved away, Claire stared at the seat pocket in front of her for several seconds before speaking. "You could have taken the better seat," she said, her voice low and stripped of edge. Naomi rested her hands over her coat. "Yes," she answered. Claire turned toward her slowly. "Then why did you not?" Outside the window, the sky had deepened into a rich indigo, and the wing light flashed at steady intervals across the metal like a pulse. Naomi considered the question with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime deciding which truths were worth offering and which were better left alone. "Because a seat is not the same thing as peace," she said. Claire lowered her eyes. The sentence landed hard, though Naomi had not meant it as punishment. Emily shifted in her sleep and made a tiny sighing sound, and both women looked at her at the same time. It changed the air between them again, softened it. Claire brushed a strand of hair back from her daughter's forehead with trembling fingers. "I should have helped her sooner," she said. "I always tell myself I know how to handle things, and then when it matters most, I just start talking too fast and making it worse." Naomi watched the mother in profile, saw the exhaustion under the expensive skincare and careful makeup, saw the fear people often wrapped in status because they did not know what else to do with it. "Most people do that when someone they love is afraid," she said. "They try to outrun the feeling instead of sitting beside it." Claire let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh and tears at the same time. "That sounds like me." Tessa returned with a paper cup of tea, a little dish of honey, and a napkin folded with more care than the moment required. She handed the cup to Naomi with both hands. "Compliments of the flight deck," she said. Then, after a brief hesitation, she turned to Claire. "Would your daughter like some apple juice when she wakes up? It usually helps after a rough takeoff." Claire blinked, surprised by the kindness. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thank you." Tessa smiled and moved on. Claire watched Naomi wrap both hands around the teacup, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. The scent of chamomile rose gently between them. Then Claire finally said the thing that had been pressing against her throat since the runway. "I judged you the moment I saw you," she whispered. "And I was wrong." Naomi looked at the steam curling above the cup before she looked up at Claire. Her face held no victory, only a calm that made the confession feel even more naked in the air. "Yes," she said softly. "You were." The truth of it sat between them without decoration. Claire did not look away this time. The old version of her might have reached for a defense, some polished little excuse about stress or travel or being misunderstood, but that version had been losing ground since the runway. Now she only sat there in the dim cabin light with her hands folded too tightly and her daughter sleeping against the window, looking like a woman who had finally heard herself clearly. "I am sorry," she said after a moment, and the words came out rougher than the rest of her, as if they had scraped something on the way up. Not the polite kind. Not the kind people say to move past an awkward moment. "I was cruel to you before I knew a single thing about you." Naomi lifted the paper cup and took a small sip of tea. It had already begun to cool, but the chamomile still held warmth and honey at the back of her tongue. She let the silence breathe before answering. "Most cruelty does not wait for information," she said quietly. Claire flinched, not because Naomi's tone was harsh, but because it was not. A hard reply would have been easier to survive. Across the aisle, the man with the magazine had gone back to reading, though Naomi noticed he had not turned a page in several minutes. The cabin around them had settled into the soft rituals of an evening flight. Ice clinked in plastic cups from the beverage cart up front. A reading light clicked on 2 rows back. The wing outside flashed white at steady intervals against the dark sky. Claire looked down at the sleeping shape of Emily, then back at Naomi. "I do not usually think of myself as that kind of person," she said. Naomi gave the smallest nod. "Very few people do." The sentence was gentle, but it left no place to hide. Claire exhaled slowly and touched the edge of the blanket over her daughter's legs. "I saw your coat, your seat, the way you came on board alone, and I decided what that meant." Naomi turned the cup once between her palms. "Yes." Claire swallowed. "And then when Daniel came out and looked at you like that, it was as if the whole cabin was seeing something I should have seen from the start." Naomi looked at her then, fully, and there was no anger in her eyes, only a weariness too dignified to call itself pain. "No," she said. "They were seeing something they were taught to miss." Claire absorbed that in silence. It changed her face again, softened it, and humbled it in ways no embarrassment alone could do. When she spoke next, her voice had lost even the last trace of performance. "Does it happen that often?" Naomi glanced toward the oval window, where the darkness beyond the glass held only her reflection and the faint red blink of a distant wing light. "Often enough that I stopped counting years ago," she said. "Stores, hotels, waiting rooms, airplanes. Sometimes it is loud. Sometimes it is wrapped in manners. But it is usually there." Claire closed her eyes briefly, as if she needed darkness to bear hearing it. "And you still helped my daughter." Naomi's gaze shifted to Emily, whose face in sleep had gone younger somehow, the fear smoothed out of it. "Your daughter was never the one I had to forgive," she said. That landed deeper than an accusation would have. Claire's eyes filled then, not dramatically, just enough to shine under the cabin lights. Before she could speak, Emily stirred and blinked awake, disoriented for a second before memory found her. She looked at Naomi first. "I did the counting," she whispered, as if reporting back from somewhere difficult. Naomi smiled. "You did." Tessa appeared beside them as if summoned by the child's voice, holding a small cup of apple juice with extra napkins tucked underneath. Emily accepted it with both hands. Claire watched the exchange, then turned back to Naomi with a look stripped bare of pride. "When we land," she said softly, "I do not want to walk off this plane still being the woman who boarded it." Naomi let Claire's words rest in the space between them for a few seconds, not to make the woman suffer, but because some promises needed silence before they meant anything. The cabin had settled into that strange in-between hush of nighttime travel, when strangers became outlines under reading lights, and the world outside the windows turned to pure darkness broken only by the steady flash of the wing. Emily sipped her apple juice with both hands and looked less like a frightened child now and more like a girl who had made it through something she had thought might swallow her whole. Naomi set her paper cup carefully on the tray table and folded her hands over her coat. "Then do not," she said at last. Claire blinked. "Do not what?" Naomi's gaze stayed gentle, but firm. "Do not walk off the plane as the same woman. But do not confuse feeling bad with being changed either. One hurts. The other costs." Claire took that in with the stillness of someone hearing a truth she knew would stay with her long after the flight ended. She looked down at the diamond on her finger, turned it once, then stopped as if even that old habit felt too polished for the moment. "You are right," she said quietly. "I have been taught how to apologize without losing status." I do not think I have been taught how to let something actually change me. Naomi gave the faintest nod. Most people who are protected by a system are not taught to see it until it fails them, or until they become honest enough to notice who it has been failing all along. Claire's eyes shone again, but this time she did not fight it. She glanced at Emily, then back at Naomi. I want my daughter to be different from me. Naomi looked at the little girl, who was tracing one finger around the rim of the juice cup, as if remembering the counting with her breath. Then let her see you become different, Naomi said. Children believe what we practice more than what we preach. The sentence seemed to settle over Claire like something both heavy and clean. She drew in a careful breath and sat a little straighter, not with old superiority, but with intention. A few minutes later the seatbelt sign chimed on again with a soft electronic tone, and Daniel's voice came over the speaker, calm as ever, thanking everyone for a smooth flight and announcing their descent into Denver. The sound of his voice pulled a private smile from Naomi. Claire heard it and looked at her. He really never forgot you, she said. Naomi glanced toward the front of the cabin, though the cockpit door was far beyond view. No, she said, and I never forgot that he chose to become the kind of man who remembered. The plane began its gradual descent, and with it came the small familiar signs of nearing land. Tray tables clicked shut. Window shades were raised. A woman 2 rows ahead gathered a sleeping toddler's blanket. Emily sat up straighter this time when the aircraft lowered through the first layer of cloud, and though her fingers tightened briefly around the pillow, she looked at Naomi and started counting on her own hand before fear could get ahead of her. 1 finger in, 1 finger out. Naomi smiled, but did not interfere. She did not need to. Beside her, Claire watched her daughter with a look that was half pride and half grief for all the ways she had mistaken control for care. When the landing gear lowered with its heavy mechanical thump beneath the floor, Emily startled, then caught herself and kept counting. Claire reached for her daughter's hand, and this time she matched the girl's breathing instead of trying to overtalk it. Naomi noticed that, and she noticed the way Claire did not once look around to see who might be watching. Change rarely announced itself in speeches. More often, it looked like a mother choosing a quieter way to love. The wheels touched the runway with a brief shudder and a long rushing hum, and as the plane rolled out beneath the bright Denver lights, Claire turned to Naomi with tears she no longer bothered to hide, and said, in a voice stripped clean of everything false, "Thank you for helping my daughter when you owed me nothing." Naomi held her gaze, steady as the runway lights passing beyond the glass, and answered with the grace that had carried her farther than anyone in row 19 had guessed. "Kindness is not a reward for good behavior," she said. "It is a choice about who I want to be." The aircraft slowed beneath the bright wash of terminal lights, the engines lowering from a roar to a deep, steady hum that seemed to loosen something in every chest it had been holding. Outside the windows, Denver spread wide and glittering against the black Colorado night, service vehicles moving in neat, quiet lines below the wing. Inside the cabin, people reached for phones, jackets, overhead bins, and the ordinary habits that returned the moment wheels touched ground. But row 19 stayed still a little longer. Emily kept her small hand open on her lap, counting one last breath without being told. Claire watched her daughter do it and said nothing, perhaps because for once she understood that the quiet mattered more than sounding capable. Naomi gathered her coat and folded the paper napkin from the tea service with the same care she gave everything that had passed through her hands with kindness. When the seatbelt sign finally clicked off, the cabin rose all at once in a rustle of impatience and retrieved luggage. People stood too fast, reached too high, shifted into the aisle before there was anywhere to go. Naomi remained seated. She had learned years ago that dignity did not hurry simply because other people did. Claire glanced toward the aisle, then back at Naomi. "Please," she said softly, and this time the word held no command in it at all. "You go first." Naomi looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "Thank you." Emily turned in her seat, the pink pillow tucked under one arm. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice still sleepy from the flight, "I am going to count next time too." Naomi smiled, and the smile reached all the way into her eyes. "Yes, you are." Claire touched her daughter's shoulder lightly, then looked up at Naomi with a face changed not by humiliation, but by effort, which was the only kind of change that lasted. "I will remember this," she said. Naomi slipped her purse over her shoulder and stood. Then make it visible, she replied. The line moved forward in slow inches until at last Naomi stepped into the jet bridge air, cooler and faintly metallic after the cabin warmth. At the aircraft door, Daniel Hayes was waiting exactly where he said he would be, one hand resting on the frame, the gold on his uniform catching the light overhead. He had likely thanked 24 passengers already, but the moment he saw Naomi, something in his face softened again into that same clear gratitude that had stunned the cabin before takeoff. He stepped aside from the door as though making room for someone far more important than himself. "Miss Brooks," he said, and there was a fullness in his voice now, the kind men carried only when memory and honor met in the same place. Naomi stopped in front of him. Up close, she could see the years in him more clearly now, the silver at his temples, the fine lines near his eyes, the life he had built one decision at a time. Daniel reached gently for the carry-on at her side. "Please," he said, "let me carry that." Naomi let him take it, and the gesture was so simple, so quiet, that it undid something deeper than a speech ever could. Behind her, Claire had stepped aside with Emily and waited, not pushing forward, not reclaiming space, only watching. Daniel looked past Naomi for a brief moment, his eyes landing on Claire and the little girl. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The truth of the flight had already spoken for itself. Then he turned back to Naomi and smiled, warm and steady. "You were never first class," he said softly, "but you taught me what it looks like." Naomi let the words settle between them, then answered in the same calm voice that had fed hungry dreams at Gate 14 and steadied a frightened child above the clouds. "Class is something people buy, Daniel," she said. "Grace is what they carry." And with the bright airport light falling across her silver hair and the night beyond the windows wide and clear, she walked forward into the terminal with the same quiet strength she had boarded with. Only now the people around her finally knew what it was worth.